The emergency klaxon screamed across Unity Station as the largest war fleet in galactic history materialized from hyperspace. 300 ships, each one a monument to destruction, cast their shadow over the diplomatic hub that had maintained peace for 2 centuries. The massive dreadnoughts bore the crimson skull insignia of the Dominion, their hulls telling stories of conquest through laser burns and collision scars. Ambassador Lee Hyojin pressed her palm against the reinforced viewing port, watching the fleet arrange itself in perfect attack formation. The lead vessel, a monstrous battleship twice the size of Unity Station itself, dwarfed everything around it. Its weapon arrays could crack a planet's crust, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Sweet stars of Andromeda, breathed Ambassador Krill of the Aquatic Consortium, his gills fluttering with terror. I've never seen so many ships in one place. The Galactic Council chamber, usually a model of diplomatic order, had dissolved into barely controlled panic. Delegates from 47 species huddled in their respective sections, emergency communicators crackling with desperate calls to homeworlds. The crystalline beings of Sector 9 were actually glowing with fear, their bodies pulsing with nervous energy. Ambassador Taman of the Centauri Collective, his forearms gesturing frantically while his tentacles writhed, leaned toward the human delegation. 17 civilizations, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The Zephyrian Empire, the Stellar Commonwealth, the hive worlds of Kepler 442, all gone. Vextel doesn't negotiate, he doesn't bargain, he doesn't show mercy. He arrives, he demands, he destroys. At the human delegation table, Hyojin studied the tactical displays with an eerie calm that made her stand out among the panicking aliens. Her dark eyes tracked the positioning of each Dominion vessel, noting their formations, their weapon orientations, their escape routes. At 35, she had spent 15 years in diplomatic service, working her way up from trade negotiations on mining asteroids to representing Earth in territorial disputes. She had faced down corporate warlords, hostile AI constructs, and even a rogue admiral from the Terran Defense Force. But nothing in her experience compared to this moment. The main viewing screen flickered to life, and every conversation in the chamber died instantly. The face that appeared was the stuff of nightmares made manifest. Warlord Vextel of the Crimson Dominion stood 9 feet tall, his reptilian features scarred by centuries of warfare. His scales, once probably green, had turned to dark bronze from countless battles. One eye was milky white from an old wound, while the other burned with an intelligence that made him far more dangerous than any mindless beast. His claws, each one the length of a human finger, tapped rhythmically against his command throne. Pathetic creatures of the so-called Galactic Council. His voice rumbled through the translation matrix, carrying the weight of absolute authority. I am Warlord Vextel, conqueror of the 17 worlds. Breaker of the Zephyrian fleet, he who walks in the ashes of empires. Several delegates actually fainted. The insectoid representative from Hive World Beta made a sound like breaking glass before collapsing in his chair. You have 1 solar cycle, Vexel continued, his scarred face showing no emotion. Each species will provide tribute according to their capacity. Military vessels, industrial capacity, population for labor, conscription. Those who comply will be permitted to exist as subjects of the Dominion. Those who refuse will join the 17 civilizations that learned the price of defiance. The transmission ended, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. Then the real panic began. Delegates screamed into their communicators, some already calling for evacuation ships. The gas-based life forms from the nebula cluster were literally expanding with terror, their containment suits straining. Ambassador Krill was frantically calculating how many of his people could be evacuated to the deep ocean worlds before the deadline. Kim Jae-ho, Hyojin's aide and the youngest member of Earth's diplomatic corps, was pale as lunar rock. Ambassador, he whispered, his voice cracking, our entire fleet is maybe 50 ships. The Dominion has 6 times that number just sitting outside. Earth Command is already talking about evacuation protocols. But Hyojin wasn't listening to the chaos around her. She was studying the tactical display, her her mind working through possibilities, probabilities, and the one thing that separated humans from every other species in the galaxy. While others saw an impossible enemy, she saw a puzzle to be solved. "Ma'am," Jeho touched her shoulder. "What are your orders?" Hyojin stood slowly, adjusting her dark blue diplomatic uniform, the one that had seen her through negotiations, with beings that could crush her with a thought. Around her, the greatest minds in the galaxy were surrendering before the fight had even begun. But Earth hadn't joined the galactic community by giving up when things looked impossible. "I'll go," she said simply, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. The chamber fell silent. Every eye, optical sensor, and consciousness projection turned toward the small human woman who had just volunteered for what everyone knew was certain death. Jeho grabbed her arm, his fingers trembling. "Ambassador, that's suicide," reports. From the Zephyrian delegation, the survivors from the Hive worlds, they all say the same thing. He doesn't negotiate. He kills every diplomat who tries to meet with him. Their bodies are displayed on his ship as trophies. Hyojin looked around the chamber at the terrified faces of beings from across the galaxy. Some had evolved from predators, others from prey, but all of them had forgotten the one thing that made survival possible when facing an apex predator. You had to be willing to do something they didn't expect. And I suppose, she said with a grim smile, that would have made her ancestors proud. "I'll have to try a different approach." The shuttle Aurora detached from Unity Station, like a tiny metal seed floating toward a forest of death. Hyojin sat in the pilot seat, her hands steady on the controls as the Crimson Dominion fleet grew larger in the viewport. Each ship was a masterpiece of destruction, their hulls decorated with the bones of conquered vessels welded into grotesque art pieces. The flagship, Bone Crusher, dominated the center of the formation, its massive bulk stretching over 2 miles from bow to stern. Ancient impact craters covered its surface like battle scars, and weapon emplacements jutted out like the spines of some primordial beast. As her shuttle approached, Hyojin could see smaller ships swarming around it like parasites, their hulls painted with fresh blood-red stripes marking recent victories. "Incoming vessel, you will dock at Bay 7, came the growling voice over the com. "Any deviation from the prescribed path will result in immediate destruction." Hyojin guided her shuttle through a maze of debris fields, the remains of ships that had challenged the Dominion and lost. She recognized some of the hull fragments, pieces of Zephyrian cruisers with their distinctive silver plating, chunks of Hive world bioships still twitching with residual life, and the crystalline shards of Andromedan vessels that sparkled. Like deadly snow, the docking bay of the Bone Crusher was a monument to suffering. The moment her shuttle's doors opened, Hyojin was hit by the stench of ozone blood, something else, the smell of hopelessness itself. The bay stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction, its ceiling lost in shadows. Massive chains hung from the darkness above, and from those chains dangled the broken hulks of enemy ships, displayed like hunting trophies. Rows of enslaved beings from conquered worlds lined the walkways, their bodies bearing the marks of their new masters. The blue-skinned aquatics of the consortium worked in underwater maintenance tanks, their gills fluttering weakly in the artificial currents. The insectoid hive workers scuttled about on damaged limbs, their once proud carapaces now cracked and dull. Most heartbreaking were the Zephyrian children, their wings clipped and their eyes vacant, sorted into work groups by age and physical capability. Crimson Dominion warriors patrolled the bay like giant predators. Each one stood over 8 feet tall, their reptilian bodies covered in natural armor that had been enhanced with cybernetic implants. Razor-sharp claws extended from their hands, and their eyes glowed with a feral intelligence that spoke of centuries of selective breeding for warfare. They watched Hyojin with the kind of interest a cat shows a mouse. Not immediate hunger, but patient anticipation. "Fresh meat?" one of them hissed in broken standard, his forked tongue flicking out to taste. Her scent, small thing, breakable. Hyojin walked past them without flinching, her diplomatic training keeping her face neutral even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The corridor leading from the docking bay was lined with more trophies, the preserved heads of defeated military commanders, their expressions frozen in final moments of terror or defiance. She recognized Admiral Kethfer of the Zephyrian Navy. His proud features now just another decoration on Vextal's swall of conquest. The deeper she went into the ship, the more apparent the Dominion's philosophy became. Everything was designed to intimidate, to crush the spirit before the body. The walls were covered in scenes of conquest carved directly into the metal, showing Dominion forces overwhelming their enemies. The lighting was harsh and red, casting everything in the color of blood. Even the air recycling system was designed to carry the scent of fear throughout the ship. Robotic sentries floated through the corridors, their sensors constantly scanning for threats or signs of rebellion among the enslaved population. These weren't the sleek, efficient droids of the civilized galaxy. They were crude, brutal things designed more for intimidation than function. Their weapon systems were prominently displayed. Their optical sensors glowed with the same predatory light as their organic masters. The throne room was the crown jewel of this empire of terror. The chamber stretched upward like a cathedral, but instead of inspiring hope, it crushed the soul. The ceiling was lost in darkness. But Hyojin could see the glint of hanging weapons, the personal arms of every leader Vextal had defeated in single combat. Swords, energy weapons, projectile launchers, and stranger devices from species she couldn't identify, all arranged in a deadly constellation above the throne. The walls were lined with weapons from dead civilizations, each one a story of conquest and extinction. The elegant energy staffs of the crystalline collective, their light forever dimmed. The bio-rifles of the hive worlds, their living components now withered and gray. The quantum disruptors of the Andromedian Empire, their infinite potential, reduced to mere decoration. But it was the skulls that truly drove home the horror of this place. Thousands of them, arranged in perfect rows along the lower walls. Not just any skulls, these were the remains of leaders, diplomats, generals, and heroes who had dared to stand against the Crimson Dominion. Each one was polished to a mirror shine and marked with the circumstances of their death. Some bore the marks of energy weapons, others the crushing grip of massive claws, and a few showed the precise cuts of ritual execution. At the center of this temple of death sat the throne itself, carved from a single asteroid and polished until it gleamed like black glass. The chair was massive, designed to accommodate Vextal's enormous frame. But it was the details that made it truly terrifying. The armrests were carved with the faces of his enemies, their expressions of fear and pain preserved in stone. Back was inscribed with the names of every world he had conquered, every species he had enslaved, every fleet he had destroyed, and on that throne sat Warlord Vextal himself. He was even more imposing in person than on the viewing screen. His reptilian form was massive, easily 9 feet tall, even sitting down, with muscles that spoke of both natural evolution and careful enhancement. His scales had the deep bronze color of old blood, and they were marked with ritual scars that told the story of his rise to power. Each scar represented a challenge overcome, an enemy defeated, a world claimed. His face was a masterpiece of predatory perfection. The milky white eye from his old wound somehow made him more terrifying, not less, as if he had incorporated even his injuries into his legend. The good eye burned with an intelligence that was far more dangerous than simple brutality. This was not a mindless beast, but a thinking predator who had turned warfare into an art form. The human delegate, he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone and distant thunder. Smaller than I expected. Your species must be truly desperate to send such a fragile creature to face me. His claws, each one the length of a combat knife, tapped against the throne's armrest in a rhythm that matched a heartbeat. Around the chamber, his warriors had positioned themselves to watch the show, their own claws extended in anticipation. Hyojin stepped forward and bowed respectfully, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of his power. Warlord Vextal, I come not to beg for mercy, but to propose a contest. The chamber fell silent. Even the enslaved beings working in the shadows stopped their tasks to listen. In the entire history of the Crimson Dominion, no one had ever walked into Vextal's presence and proposed anything other than surrender. The alien warlord's eyes narrowed, his good eye focusing on her with laser intensity. Contest. The word rolled off his tongue like he was tasting something new and potentially dangerous. You wish to fight me in single combat, your small form? Against my claws and strength? No, Hyojin replied calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. I propose we fight with our minds. Prove your superiority through strategy and cunning rather than brute force. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Vextel's laugh erupted from his throat like a volcanic explosion, shaking the entire chamber. His warriors joined in, their voices creating a symphony of predatory amusement that echoed off the walls. The sound was so loud that several of the enslaved beings cowered in terror. Interesting, he said when the laughter finally died down. Very interesting indeed. In 3 centuries of conquest, no one has ever challenged me to a battle of wits. What are the terms of this contest? Hyojin felt a small spark of hope. He was curious, and curiosity was something she could work with. 3 scenarios, 3 challenges. If you win, Earth submits without resistance. If I win, she paused, letting the moment build. You hear what I have to offer. Vextel leaned forward on his throne, his massive form casting an even longer shadow. And if you lose? Hyojin looked up at the thousands of skulls lining the walls, then back at the alien warlord. Then you can add my skull to your collection. The warlord's smile revealed rows of teeth like crystalline daggers. Agreed. Air in the throne room crackled with energy as ancient holographic projectors descended from the shadowy ceiling. These weren't the sleek displays of modern galactic technology. They were brutal, functional machines cobbled together from the computers of conquered civilizations. Crystalline processors from the Andromedian Empire sparked alongside bioneural networks from the Hive world, all forced to work in harmony under Dominion control. The first scenario materialized in stunning detail above the throne room floor. Star system hung in the air, complete with 3 inhabited worlds orbiting a young yellow star. The planets pulsed with different colors, red for the volcanic world of the Kefri, blue for the ocean planet of the Solani, and green for the forest world that had recently been colonized by humans. The Kepler 438 system announced the AI construct, its voice a mixture of dozens of conquered languages. 3 species, 1 star system, unlimited resources. The asteroid belt contains enough rare metals to build 1,000 fleets. The gas giants' moons hold enough fuel to power a galactic empire. All 3 species claim territorial rights. Vextel leaned back in his throne, studying the display with the casual interest of someone who had solved this puzzle 100 times before. His warriors gathered closer, their claws clicking against the floor, in anticipation of their master's wisdom. Simple Vextel growled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Destroy the 2 weaker factions, enslave the survivors, strip the system bare. The Kefri tunneling abilities would be useful in the asteroid mines. The Solani can work the underwater facilities on the ice moons. Both species would provide adequate labor for the next 50 years. He gestured with one massive claw, and the hologram shifted to show Dominion warships descending on the 3 worlds. Orbital bombardments turned cities to glass. Evacuation ships were picked off like insects. Within hours, 2 civilizations would be reduced to slavery, and the 3rd would be nothing but radioactive dust. Efficient, rumbled one of his lieutenants, a scarred veteran whose left arm had been replaced with a cybernetic weapon. Quick profit, minimal resistance. But Hyojin was studying the display with different eyes. She walked around the hologram, observing it from every angle, her mind processing possibilities that had never occurred to the warlord or his followers. What if instead, she said quietly, you established a joint mining operation? The chamber fell silent except for the low hum of the holographic generators. Several warriors actually looked confused, as if she had spoken in a language they didn't understand. Hyojin stepped into the hologram itself, the light patterns shifting around her as she manipulated the display with practiced gestures. Each species contributes their strengths. The Kefri have natural tunnel vision and can see mineral deposits. Through solid rock, their bodies are adapted for working in zero-atmosphere conditions. The Solani can work in high radiation environments that would kill most other species. and their bioships can navigate the gas giant's atmospheric storms. Humans can coordinate complex logistics and have experience managing multi-species operations. Hologram transformed in her hands. Instead of burning worlds, it now showed mining platforms sharing the asteroid belt. Instead of slave ships, it displayed cargo vessels bearing the flags of 3 different species working together. The numbers began to calculate themselves, showing resource extraction rates, population growth, technological advancement, weakness. Vexel spat, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Why share when you can take everything? Because, Hyojin said, highlighting the projection outcomes with a gesture in 10 years. Your method yields 40% of the system's resources. Before it's depleted and worthless. The slave populations will have died from overwork, the mines will be exhausted, and you'll have to move on to find new worlds to strip bare. She manipulated the display again, showing a different timeline. My method yields 90% of the system's resources over 50 years. The populations grow instead of dying. They develop new technologies that make extraction more efficient, and they're happy to share because they're partners, not slaves. Plus, you gain 3 loyal allies instead of 3 dead enemies. For the first time in decades, Vexel fell completely silent. His good eye fixed on the numbers floating in the hologram, his mind working through calculations he had never considered before. Around the chamber, his warriors shifted uncomfortably, sensing their master's uncertainty. The hologram shifted again, this time showing a more complex scenario. A rebellion had broken out on a conquered world, with cities burning and dominion. Forces under siege. The Proxima Beta incident, the AI announced. Conquered population has risen in revolt. Dominion garrison is under attack. Rebel forces have superior numbers, but inferior weapons. Vexel's response was immediate and decisive. Crush them. Public executions of the rebel leaders. Orbital bombardment of any city that shows resistance. Make an example that will prevent future uprisings. The hologram showed the familiar pattern, massive ships descending from orbit, energy beams turning entire city blocks to ash. The systematic execution of anyone who had ever spoken against Dominion rule. It was efficient, brutal, and absolute. But Hyojin was shaking her head. What if we discovered why they're rebelling first? The reports say they're attacking food distribution centers and government buildings. Maybe they're starving because their tribute quota is impossible to meet. Maybe their children are being taken as slaves, or their sick are being denied medical care. She touched the hologram. New information appeared. Agricultural reports showing crop failures. Population statistics revealing declining birth rates. Medical data indicating widespread malnutrition. Address the cause, not the symptom. She continued. Reduce the tribute quota to sustainable levels. Provide medical aid. Establish fair labor practices. The rebellion stops because the reasons for rebelling disappear. You would show weakness to rebels. Vexel's voice carried a dangerous edge. Every conquered world would see that resistance is rewarded with concessions. It would show strength. Through understanding? Hyojin replied calmly. Rebellion crushed by force will rise again the moment your ships leave orbit. A rebellion ended through justice stays ended, and the next world you conquer will have heard that the Dominion is fair to those who serve willingly. The Warlord's claws dug into his throne's armrests, leaving deep gouges in the stone. This was a concept that challenged everything he had built his empire upon, the idea that strength could be shown through mercy, that control could be maintained, through partnership rather than fear. The third scenario materialized, and this one made even Vexel, this massive frame, tense with concern. The hologram showed a fleet of unknown ships, each one larger than anything in the Dominion Navy. Their hulls were smooth and featureless, giving no hint of their origin or capabilities. But their formations spoke of military discipline and overwhelming power. The Void Fleet. The AI intoned ominously. Origin unknown. Technology superior to current Dominion standards. Estimated fleet strength, 800 vessels. Current trajectory, direct course for Dominion space. Estimated time to contact, 6 months. This was every conqueror's nightmare. the arrival of something bigger and more dangerous than themselves. Vextel had built his empire by being the strongest predator in the galaxy. But now something had emerged from the dark spaces between stars that made his mighty fleet look like toys. "I would fight," he said slowly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Rally the entire Dominion fleet. Meet them at the border worlds. Die with honor if necessary, but make them pay for every system they take." Or Hyo Jin said with a slight smile, "You could make them your allies." The suggestion was so unexpected that several of Vextel's warriors actually took a step backward. The idea of the mighty Crimson Dominion seeking alliance with anyone was beyond their comprehension. "Think about it," Hyojin continued, manipulating the hologram to show different possibilities. "What do they want that you can provide? Maybe they're refugees from an even more dangerous enemy. Maybe they're explorers looking for resources you can help them find. Maybe they're seeking knowledge that your conquered civilizations possess." She gestured, and the display showed Dominion and Void fleet ships working together, their combined might facing some unseen threat from beyond the galactic rim. "What do you need that they can offer? Their technology could make your fleet invincible. Their knowledge could help you understand threats you've never imagined. Turn your greatest threat into your greatest asset, and together you become something more powerful than either could be alone." Vextel stared at the hologram for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities that had never occurred to him. For 3 centuries, he had seen every encounter as a contest to be won through superior force, but this small human was showing him patterns he had never considered: strength through cooperation, security through partnership, growth through mutual benefit. The chamber remained silent except for the hum of the holographic generators and the distant sounds of the ship's operations. Every eye was on the Warlord, waiting to see how he would respond to these impossible ideas. For the first time since his youth, Vextel found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about power. The holographic displays flickered and died as the debate continued, leaving the throne room lit only by the eerie red glow of the ship's emergency lighting. Hours had passed since the contest began, but neither Hyojin nor Vextel seemed to notice. What had started as a simple challenge had evolved into something far more profound: a clash between 2 entirely different ways of seeing the universe. Vextel had dismissed his warriors hours ago, sending them away with a gesture when their restless movements became a distraction. Only he and Hyojin remained in the vast chamber, surrounded by the trophies of his conquests and the skulls of his enemies. The enslaved beings had been ordered to continue their work in silence, creating a strange backdrop of quiet activity around their intense conversation. "In the Vorthon campaign," Vexel rumbled, his voice taking on the tone of someone reliving old memories, "I faced a species that could read emotions through bioelectric fields. They knew every tactical move before I made it, could sense fear and aggression from across a star system. Conventional warfare was impossible." He gestured to one of the weapons mounted on the wall, a crystalline staff that pulsed with faint inner light. "I solved the problem by creating emotional dampening fields around my ships. My warriors became emotionless killing machines, unreadable to their enemy sensors." The Vorthons fell within a week. Hyojin studied the weapon with interest, but her expression was thoughtful rather than impressed. "What if instead of making your warriors emotionless, you had approached them with genuine peaceful intentions? If they could read emotions, they would have known you meant no harm. They might have welcomed you as allies." Naive Vextel replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "They would have seen it as weakness. Would they?" Hyojin challenged. "Or would they have seen it as strength? It takes courage to approach someone with open hands instead of drawn weapons. It takes confidence to offer partnership to someone who could destroy you." The Warlord's scarred face twisted in concentration. For 3 centuries, he had solved every problem through superior force. But this human kept showing him patterns he had never considered. Where he saw conquest, she saw cooperation. Where he saw submission, she saw partnership. "Your species thinks differently," he admitted finally, studying Hyojin with new interest. His good eye tracked her movements, noting the way she stood without fear in his presence, the way she spoke as an equal rather than a supplicant. Where I see enemies, you see potential allies. Where I see obstacles, you see opportunities. Because we learned something you haven't yet, Hyojin replied, her voice gentle but firm. The strongest empires aren't built on fear, they're built on hope. Fear makes enemies who plot your downfall every moment they draw breath. Hope makes families who will fight to protect what you've built together. She activated her personal datapad, the small device looking insignificant in the vast chamber. But as the holographic display activated, filling the space between them with images from Earth's history, the contrast was striking. Where Vextel's trophies showed death and conquest, Hyojin's images showed life and growth. The first image showed ancient Earth, scarred by nuclear warfare, its cities burning and its oceans poisoned. This was my world 500 years ago, she said quietly. We fought wars for thousands of years. We nearly destroyed ourselves multiple times. Nation against nation, ideology against ideology, race against race. The images shifted, showing the slow rebuilding process. Former enemies working side by side to clean contaminated zones. Scientists from warring nations collaborating on medical breakthroughs. Children playing together while their grandparents had once tried to kill each other. But we learned, Hyojin continued, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. We learned that our greatest strength comes not from conquering others, but from lifting them up with us. Every former enemy who became a friend made us stronger. Every culture we preserved, instead of destroying, added to our knowledge. Vexel examined the images with growing fascination. His claws, normally used for tearing and destroying, traced gentle patterns in the air as he manipulated the holographic display. Here were scenes that challenged everything he thought he knew about power and control, former enemies working together to terraform dead worlds. Diverse cultures celebrating together in massive festivals that spanned entire continents. Once warring nations sharing technology freely, their combined efforts reaching for the stars. The transformation was so complete that it seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The European Union, Hyojin explained, highlighting one section of the display. Nations that had fought each other for centuries became so closely allied that war between them became unthinkable. The African Federation took tribes that had been enemies for thousands of years and turned them into the most advanced technological civilization on Earth. The Pan-Asian collective merged completely different political systems into something that worked better than any of them had individually. The Warlord's breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more thoughtful. For the first time in centuries, he was seeing alternatives to the path he had chosen. This is difficult to accept, he said slowly. In my experience, peace is always temporary. Someone always seeks to take what others have built.
That's true,
Hyojin agreed. But what if instead of waiting for someone to take it, you invited them to help build it? What if the strongest defense wasn't walls and weapons, but bonds so strong that attacking one member meant facing all the others? She showed him images of Earth's first contact with alien species, not the violent conquests that had marked Vextel's expansion, but careful diplomatic meetings, cultural exchanges, joint exploration missions. The results spoke for themselves. Thriving trade relationships, shared scientific discoveries, and a mutual defense network that had kept the peace for over a century. My people, Vextel said quietly, his voice taking on a tone Hyojin had never heard before. Vulnerability. We were scholars once, philosophers and artists. Our world was covered in great libraries and universities. We created music that could make the stars themselves weep with beauty. He gestured toward a section of the throne room where the lighting was dimmer, and Hyojin realized she was looking at remnants of that lost civilization. Ancient stone tablets covered in elegant script, musical instruments that seemed to be grown rather than built, artistic sculptures that captured movement and emotion in ways that human art had never achieved. Then the hegemony wars came. Vexta continued, his voice heavy with old pain. 3 alliances fighting for control of our galaxy's core. My people tried to remain neutral. To continue our studies and our art, we thought knowledge and beauty would protect us from the violence. His claws traced old scars on his hide, each one marking a memory too painful to voice. We were wrong. The war came to us anyway. Our libraries burned. Our artists were enslaved or killed. Our philosophers were forced to choose between death and joining one of the warring factions. Hyojin felt her heart clench as she began to understand. This wasn't just a conqueror speaking. This was a survivor. Someone who had seen everything he loved destroyed and had chosen to become the weapon rather than the victim. I chose survival, Vextel said simply. I chose to become strong enough that no one could ever take anything from me again. I chose to take from others before they could take from me. And it worked, Hyojin acknowledged. You became the strongest force in the galaxy. No one can threaten you now. No, Vexel agreed. But I am alone. I have strength, but I have no one to share it with. I have power, but nothing worth protecting except the power itself. The chamber fell silent except for the distant hum of the ship's engines. Around them, the trophies of conquest seemed less impressive now, more like the desperate hoardings of someone who had forgotten what was truly valuable. It's not too late to remember, Hyojin said gently. Strength through unity is still strength. It's just ... better. Your scholars and artists don't have to be gone forever. They can live again in the civilizations you choose to nurture instead of destroy. The Warlord was quiet for a long moment, his claws tracing patterns on his throne's armrests. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Show me, he said. Show me this better way. In that moment, Hyojin knew she had won something more valuable than any contest. She had reached the scholar and artist that still lived. Beneath the Conqueror's scars, the emergency klaxons of Unity Station had been silent for 12 hours. But the tension in the Galactic Council chamber was thick enough to cut with a plasma blade. Every delegate sat on the edge of their seats, watching the main viewing screen that showed the Bone Crusher drifting motionless in space. No communications had come from the flagship since Ambassador Hyojin had boarded nearly half a day ago. She's dead, whispered Ambassador Krill of the Aquatic Consortium, his gills fluttering with nervous energy. Vextel has added another skull to his collection, and now he'll come for all of us. The crystalline beings from Sector 9 were pulsing with anxious light patterns, their bodies creating a disco of fear across their section of the chamber. Life forms had contracted into tight, fearful spheres within their containment suits. Suddenly, the massive doors at the chamber's entrance began to slide open with a mechanical groan that echoed through the silent hall. Every head optical sensor and consciousness projection turned toward the sound. What they saw defied every expectation. Ambassador Lee Hyojin walked through the doorway. Her diplomatic uniform slightly wrinkled but otherwise intact. She looked tired but unharmed, and more surprisingly, she was smiling. Behind her, filling the doorway with his massive frame, came Warlord Vexel himself. The chamber erupted into chaos. Several delegates actually fainted on the spot. The Centauri Collective's Ambassador Taman made a sound like a deflating balloon and collapsed in his chair. Security robots immediately activated their defensive protocols, their weapons systems, humming to life before being hastily deactivated by confused operators. Impossible, breathed the elderly Chancellor Vorth of the Stellar Assembly, his ancient voice barely audible over the pandemonium. Vextel moved with surprising grace for someone of his size, his claws clicking against the metal floor as he approached the central speaking platform. His scarred face was calm, almost serene, a complete contrast to the terrifying Warlord who had threatened them just hours before. The weapon displays that had adorned his armor were gone, placed by simple ceremonial robes that seemed almost humble on his massive frame. When he reached the speaking platform, the chamber's acoustics carried his voice to every corner without amplification. The sound that emerged was not the threatening growl they had heard before, but something deeper, more thoughtful, honored. Delegates of the Galactic Council, he began, his words carefully chosen and precisely delivered. I come before you not as a conqueror, but as someone who has remembered what it means to build rather than destroy. The silence that followed was so complete that the station's life support system sounded like thunder in comparison. Every being in the chamber stared at the Warlord as if he had suddenly sprouted wings and begun singing opera. I hereby dissolve the Crimson Dominion's war machine, Vextal announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. I request to join the Galactic Council as military advisor to the human delegation and protector of peaceful species throughout the galaxy. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates leaped to their feet, shouting in dozens of languages. The translation matrix overloaded, trying to process the cacophony of voices, creating a feedback loop that added electronic screeching to the biological chaos. Order! Order! Chancellor Vorth hammered his ceremonial gavel against the podium so hard it cracked. This is impossible. This must be some kind of trick. Ambassador Taman of the Centauri Collective managed to stand on shaking legs, his arms gesturing wildly while his tentacles writhed in distress. What did you do to him? He demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at Hyojin. What kind of mind control technology does Earth possess? What weapon could possibly turn the galaxy's most feared predator into? This Hyojin smiled, the expression transforming her tired features. We offered him something better than conquest. We offered him a chance to build instead of destroy, to protect instead of terrorize, to be remembered as a creator rather than a destroyer. She gestured toward Vexel, who nodded slowly, his scarred face showing an emotion that no one in the chamber had ever associated with him before. Peace. For 50 years, I have taken from the galaxy, he said, his voice carrying old pain and new determination. I have burned worlds, enslaved populations, and turned entire star systems into monuments to my own power. I have been feared, and in my fear of others, I forgot what it meant to be more than just a weapon. He paused, looking around the chamber, at the faces of beings whose species he had terrorized for decades. Now, I wish to give back. The Crimson Dominion's fleets will become the Council's shield. Our warriors will protect the weak instead of preying upon them. Our ships will defend trade routes instead of raiding them. Our knowledge of warfare will be used to prevent conflicts instead of starting them. The transformation that followed was nothing short of miraculous. Within days, reports began flowing in from across the galaxy. Dominion war fleets that had been terrorizing shipping lanes suddenly began escorting merchant vessels. Conquered worlds received messages offering reparations and genuine autonomy. Enslaved populations were not only freed, but given technological aid to rebuild their civilizations. The most shocking changes came from within the Dominion military itself. Warriors who had known nothing but conquest for their entire lives struggled to understand their new role as protectors. Vexel himself worked tirelessly to retrain his forces, teaching them to see strength and restraint, power and protection, and honor in service to others. Captain Zatak, one of Vextel's most trusted commanders, later described the transformation. For years, we measured success by how much we could destroy. Now we measure it by how much we can preserve. It is difficult to learn, but it feels right in a way that conquest never did. The Bone Crusher itself underwent a dramatic transformation. The throne room, once a temple of death and conquest, was converted into a diplomatic meeting space where former enemies learned to become friends. The skull collections were removed and given proper burials. Weapon displays were replaced with art and cultural artifacts from the civilizations that were now partners rather than subjects. The most powerful moment came 6 months later, when representatives from the 17 civilizations that had been conquered by the Dominion met aboard the transformed flagship. Instead of demanding revenge, they came seeking partnership. The Zephyrian delegation, whose homeworld had been the first to fall to Vextel's forces, presented him with a gift, a sculpture made from the metal of their destroyed ships, reformed into a symbol of peace. "You took our ships," said Admiral Cuthbert's daughter, her wings spread in a gesture of acceptance rather than challenge. "Now we give them back to you willingly, transformed into something beautiful instead of something destructive." The galaxy watched in amazement as trade routes that had been dead for decades reopened under Dominion protection. Scientific expeditions ventured into dangerous regions of space, knowing that Vextel's warriors would guard them from pirates and natural hazards. Refugee populations found safe harbor on former Dominion worlds, where they were welcomed as citizens rather than slaves. When asked about her success, Ambassador Lee Haojin gave interviews that would be studied in diplomatic academies for centuries to come. Everyone wants to belong to something greater than themselves, she said simply. Vexthal was no different. We just showed him that greater doesn't have to mean feared. It can mean loved, respected, and trusted. The Crimson Dominion became the Council's most stalwart defenders, and Vexthal himself became known not as a conqueror, but as the galaxy's most unlikely protector. Children across dozens of worlds grew up with bedtime stories about the Warlord who learned to love instead of hate, to build instead of destroy. Years later, when historians tried to understand how one human diplomat had transformed the galaxy's greatest threat into its greatest protector, they found the answer in humanity's oldest wisdom. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb or a fleet of warships. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply offering someone a better way to live. And in the end, the galaxy learned that hope really could triumph over fear, that cooperation really was stronger than conquest, and that sometimes even the most unlikely people could find redemption when someone believed they were worth saving. The age of the Crimson Dominion had ended. The age of the Galactic Alliance had begun. The end.